Hello everybody, and today's story is called The Games We Play and is by Pauline Clooney in Newbridge, County Kildare. The celebration of Christmas is portrayed as a great family occasion, a time when young and old join together for that special dinner, fun and games, but it can often be an occasion when tensions can come bubbling to the surface. The grandmother wore a purple paper crown that was held in place with ladybird clips borrowed from the youngest grandchild. Every so often she patted it as if to check that it was still in place. The others had lost theirs earlier on in the evening or had taken them off. She held her fanned cards close to her chest, tilting her head down over the double chins to look at them. There were accusations earlier about reneging and not robbing, all ending when the mother cleared the table with the same sweeping movement used to clean it with the dishcloth. As tears pooled the mother's eyes, she had apologised. She said she was tired. She said there was a lot involved in getting the Christmas dinner, and she always worried about little things like the amount of onion in the stuffing or maybe a power cut. She said the ESB weren't beyond throwing the kibosh on the festivities with their strikes. The child seemed happy to see them playing cards again, as she smiled at her mother and gave her father a thumbs up. Every so often the father would interject with reassuring platitudes. "That turkey was lovely and moist, mother. You have the knack all right. Baste it to perfection." It was hard to read the grandmother's face. Was she agreeing with him? The mother stared at her each time, but the grandmother gave nothing away. "Did you enjoy your dinner, grandmother? You're saying nothing," the mother said. "I'm half afraid to voice an opinion after your previous little strop," she said. "I think it's time for a cuppa and a bit of Christmas cake. What do you say to that, Ma?" The father looked anxiously at the mother. He called her Ma when he was being affectionate, playful. It was short for her name. The mother's movements in the kitchen were snappy, deliberate, her arms conducting. The gush of water filling the kettle stilled her momentarily, as if she was witnessing something she had never seen before. The white icing on the cake seemed resistant to the serrated edge of the knife, and the mother leaned forward and over it, pushing down until it glided through the packed fruit. She cut large, generous slices. Still wearing the mantle of peace broker, the father offered his annual festive philosophy. "Well, it's as far away now as it ever was," he said. Throughout the adult shenanigans, the child continued playing Ludo with her sisters. The grandmother had brought the children a compendium box of games. The cover of the box promised hours of fun for all the family, but they only recognised 2 games in it, Ludo and Snakes and Ladders. They couldn't play Snakes and Ladders. The youngest was afraid of snakes, so Ludo it was. At the start of the evening they sat upright, expectant, but their poses had slipped and slouched, so that they now reclined at awkward angles on the couch, empty chocolate wrappers and half-eaten bars strewn around them. Santi had brought the child and her older sister musical typewriters, but they had been assigned hours earlier to the top shelf in the cupboard under the stairs. The racket had been too much for the grandmother. The child's typewriter was blue. Before it was confiscated, she could play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star in it. When she accompanied the Pope that morning giving his Urbi et Orbi message on the television, her father clapped and said Liberace wouldn't get a look in. The mother won the first game after the tea. As she drew in the pile of coins, the grandmother's jawline began to set. Her lips were pursed and she straightened her back, thrusting her ample chest forward. "I'm parched. Could someone get me a mineral?" she said. "Child, get your granny a glass of lemonade," the mother said. The child had no sooner left the couch in answer to her mother's request when the grandmother continued. "I think it might have been the cake. It was fierce dry. You didn't put enough whiskey in it." The statement was directed at the mother. The father looked at the mother, a combination of fear and pleading in his eyes. The mother folded her arms and sat in her chair, her chin pointing up at the paper decorations draping from the ceiling. She made a sort of kissing sound with her lips before she spoke. "It took a lot of eating cake for you to figure that one out." She followed up with angry words about greed, about whose recipe was being used in the first place, about compliments always sticking in certain people's throats. The youngest, the one with the snake phobia, started to cry and a guilty silence descended. Nobody noticed the child placing the glass at the grandmother's elbow. With a determined, scooping movement like a theatrical croupier, the grandmother swept the stash of money into her cupped hand, knocking over the drink. The lemonade spread like a breaking wave, soaking everything in its wake. The grandmother, with angry red circles dotting her cheeks, announced that she wanted to go home. This was a new departure. She always stayed until the day after Stevens's day. The child went back and sat with her sisters, asking whose turn it was to throw the dice. The father, rubbing his hands together, even though the house was warm, leaned his head in the direction of the grandmother and whispered, "Be the hokey. Maybe there was too much whiskey in the cake after all," he said. The grandmother whipped her head away and shot him back a dirty look. The mother got up and went to the scullery to get the dishcloth. As she passed the cut cake on the counter, she pinched up a few crumbs and chewed them slowly with knowing nods of her head. Lifting cups and then cards in one hand and mopping with the other, the mother announced, "You can't spend Christmas night on your own. It wouldn't be right. The child will go with you too." At the mention of her name, the child threw a startled look, first to the mother, then to the father. The grandmother didn't miss a beat. "Right so, you better give Mick a ring." Mick was her son, and the only one in the extended family to have a car. The father voiced his concern that Mick would have a few drinks in him, because of the day that was in it, but the mother, in encouraging, enthusiastic tones, said he'd be grand. With no other cars in the road, there'd be no fear of him. Nobody seemed to notice the child. She widened her eyes as big as she could, slightly tilting her head back as she gulped down the lump in her throat. The father winked at her. She didn't give him a thumbs up this time. The grandmother waited for her son in a chair by the kitchen door. Her coat was buttoned to the collar, her scarf tied firmly under her chin. Her black bag, clutched with both hands, was perched on her lap. The father turned up the television. The mother cleared off the table. The child went upstairs to pack a bag and cry openly. Mick sang Jingle Bells on a loop between the two houses. The father had been right earlier about the drink. However, all obstacles were avoided, and he waited in the car until his mother and niece were safely through the front door and the hall light turned on. 2 beeps of the horn, and he screeched the car around, speeding back down the road. The house was cold, and there was a stench of stale urine in the hallway. The child's nose twitched. She left her bag at the end of the stairs and went into the kitchen. She turned on the television and sat at the table, folding her arms and resting her chin on them, watching the black and white picture talking shape. The grandmother was a flurry of activity. She hauled a gas heater over from its perch beside her armchair by the range, and she placed it beside the child. While standing with one finger pressed on the ignition button as the red glow spread through the grid, she stretched over to the window and pulled the curtains with the other hand. In the back kitchen, she put on a saucepan of milk. When the grandmother placed the mug of cocoa on the table, the child, without looking up, said she didn't like cocoa anymore. The grandmother disappeared into the front room and came back with a heavily taped cardboard box. With exaggerated gestures, as if it was a speed test, she opened the box and emptied out the contents. A variety of Rowntree Macintosh products spilt onto the table. Her youngest daughter, living in England, worked there. She invited the child to take whatever and as much as she wanted. She said they could have their own secret Christmas feast. The child refused. She said she was sick of chocolate. The grandmother scanned the room anxiously, like one frantically looking for something they'd lost, and when her eyes fixed on the dresser, she suggested that the child should get a chair and bring down the deck of cards from the top shelf, and she would teach her how to play 25. "Wouldn't it be gas if next year you just sat at the table, Maria, and told your daddy to deal you a hand?" she said. "I'll teach you about robbing and reneging too. That's where the real fun is." In an uncharacteristic outburst, the child straightened up and told the old woman exactly what she thought of her cocoa and her sweets and her cards. She cruelly reminded her of the bucket of wee upstairs that she'd forgotten to empty, and she said all she wanted to do was go home to the Christmas decorations and play with the musical typewriter that she got from Santi. The grandmother looked taken aback at the outburst as she straightened up, thrusting her chest forward. She hissed at the child. "Ah, there's no such thing as Santi. You're old enough now to know that." The child was silent. The grandmother was also silent as she slowly put the sweets back into the box and stuck the masking tape back along the join of the lid, all without glancing at her granddaughter. She left it in the middle of the table and plopped down into her armchair by the unlit range, joining her hands on her lap as she circled her thumbs. The national anthem was playing. The child reached over and reopened the box, taking out a Yorkie. She carefully unwrapped the bar as if it was a Christmas present, and pointing the exposed chunks at the range, said, "Granny, I think you need to get rid of that and build a proper fireplace with a chimney." The grandmother nodded and said she would. A white line travelled in a continuous motion down the television screen as the last strains of Amhrán na Bhíonn faded away. Good night, everybody, and